Get rid of it. I don't want a child, especially not from a girl who scrubs my floors, Don Ramirez said, his voice as cold as the contracts he signed in blood. Years later, he saw her standing beside two boys who carried his unmistakable dark eyes and defiant stare. And for the first time in his ruthless life, Dominic Ramirez felt his empire crack. The thick envelope of cash landed on the glass table between them like a guillotine blade. $150. 000 meant to erase 6 months of stolen glances and a future that would never see daylight. Christina had rehearsed this moment for 4 sleepless nights, imagining every possible way to tell him, picturing his shock transforming into something resembling warmth, maybe even protection from a man who'd built his fortune on protecting nothing but territory. But instead, he stood with his back to her, staring out at the city sprawled below like his personal chessboard, his silence more crushing than any threat he'd ever delivered. She pressed her cleaning-gloved hand against her stomach, still flat beneath the stained uniform, still hiding the life she didn't even know was twins yet. Gone was the man who'd found her crying in the service hallway after his associates mocked her accent, who traced her collarbone in the darkness of his private study and whispered about seeing her differently than the others did, about how she made him feel human. Now there was only the heir to the Ramirez syndicate, a man raised from childhood to value control over connection, power over people. He said this was the solution to everything, that the money would cover the procedure, 6 months' rent in whatever city she chose, and enough for her to disappear completely, somewhere his enemies would never think to look, somewhere she'd never be a weakness he couldn't afford. She asked him about the nights he'd held her, about the promises, about that evening 3 weeks ago when he'd come to her tiny apartment with bruised knuckles and confessed he was drowning in a life he never chose, and she was the only thing that felt real. He turned then, and the man looking back at her wore his father's eyes, empty, calculating, already erasing her from memory. The tattooed hand that once traced patterns on her skin now pushed the envelope closer, a final transaction. Take it and go, Christina. This, he gestured between them, was never going to survive in my world. You knew that. But she hadn't known. And as she looked at the man she'd foolishly loved, still on her knees with soapy water pooling beneath her, Christina Reed made a decision that would change everything. She would leave the money, but she would never let him erase what he'd created. Before we see if Christina escapes this nightmare, rate this betrayal on a scale of 1 to 10 in the comments. Can she survive raising twins while hiding from the most dangerous man in the city? The elevator descended 43 floors, and Christina counted every single one, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release. The cleaning cart rattled beside her, mop handles clanging with each floor that brought her closer to freedom or catastrophe. She couldn't tell which anymore. Her reflection in the polished brass doors showed a woman she barely recognized, eyes red-rimmed but dry, jaw set with a determination that felt borrowed from someone braver. When the doors finally opened to the underground parking garage, the sound of rain greeted her like a symphony of escape. It was past midnight, the kind of hour when even Ramirez's security guards grew complacent, when the cameras in the service areas sometimes developed convenient blind spots. She'd studied their patterns for weeks without knowing why, some instinct preparing her for a moment she'd prayed would never come. The money was still upstairs, all $150,000 of it, arranged in neat stacks that probably smelled like gun oil and broken promises. She'd looked at it for exactly 7 seconds before turning away, before grabbing only what she'd brought with her into this building 6 months ago, her dignity, her breath, and a life growing inside her that Ramirez would never touch. Thunder cracked overhead as she pushed through the service exit, and the rain hit her like a baptism she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Within seconds, her uniform was plastered to her skin, her hair a dark curtain blocking her vision, but she didn't slow down. Her apartment was 12 blocks north, but she couldn't go there. Ramirez knew the address, had been there 3 times, had memorized the creaking floorboard by her bed and the broken lock on the bathroom door she'd never had money to fix. The bus station. That was her only option. The thought crystallized with each pounding step on rain-slicked pavement, her cheap canvas shoes filling with water, her lungs burning with the kind of fear that tasted like copper. She had $340 in her bank account, money she'd been saving for a winter coat, for textbooks to finish her nursing certification, for a future that had just detonated in a penthouse office overlooking a city that suddenly felt like a cage. A black sedan turned the corner behind her, and Christina's entire body seized. She ducked into an alley between a shuttered bodega and a pawn shop with iron bars over the windows, pressing herself against the wet brick, counting her heartbeats until the car passed. It wasn't one of Ramirez's. She knew their makes and models the way a prey animal knows the scent of predators: sleek Mercedes with tinted windows, BMWs with modifications that made them faster than anything the police drove. The alley opened onto a side street she'd walked 100 times on her way to work, but everything looked different now, transformed by rain and desperation into an obstacle course she had to navigate blind. A homeless man huddled under a fire escape called out something she couldn't hear over the storm, and she pressed 2 of her last 20s into his hand without stopping, some part of her recognizing a fellow refugee from the world's cruelty. The digital clock above the pharmacy read 12:47 a.m. when she finally saw the bus station's fluorescent glow bleeding through the rain. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the door handle, and when she stumbled inside, the sudden absence of rain felt louder than the storm itself. The night clerk looked up from his phone, took in her soaked uniform and wild eyes, and something in his expression shifted toward concern rather than suspicion. "Where do you need to go, miss?" The question hung in the recycled air between them, and Christina realized she didn't have an answer. Where could she go that Ramirez's network wouldn't eventually reach? His organization had roots in 7 states, connections that spanned from dock workers to district attorneys, from street dealers to the mayor's chief of staff. She'd heard him on the phone enough times to know his power wasn't contained by city limits or even state lines. "Wherever the next bus goes," she heard herself say, and the clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "That'd be heading south, leaves in 22 minutes, makes stops in 6 cities before the final destination." He paused, studying her face with the kind of recognition that suggested he'd seen this scene before, different woman, same desperate energy. "Coastal route, takes about 9 hours. The coast. The word settled in her chest like an anchor, heavy, but somehow steadying. She could disappear into a beach town, somewhere Ramirez would never think to look because he hated sand, hated anything that couldn't be controlled or conquered. She remembered him saying once that the ocean made him feel small, and he'd built his entire empire on never feeling small again. She counted out bills with numb fingers, watching water drip from her clothes onto the grimy linoleum. The ticket felt impossibly light in her hand, a slip of paper that represented the complete destruction of everything she'd built in this city and the fragile beginning of something she couldn't yet name. In the bathroom, she peeled off her uniform and stuffed it into the trash bin, covering it with paper towels like she was burying evidence of a crime. Her street clothes were in a locker at the penthouse, along with her good shoes and the necklace her mother had given her before dying. All of it would stay there, another woman's belongings in another woman's life. She pulled on the only other thing in her bag, an oversized hoodie she'd stolen from Ramirez months ago, back when stealing his clothes felt intimate rather than necessary. The bus was already boarding when she emerged, and she climbed the steps without looking back, found a seat in the very last row, and pressed her forehead against the cold window. As the engine rumbled to life and the station's lights began to recede, she finally let herself place both hands against her stomach. Against the secret she'd been carrying for 8 weeks, without knowing it would save her life. The city disappeared into rain and darkness, and Christina Reed disappeared with it, leaving behind only a woman who'd scrubbed floors in a monster's penthouse and mistaken cruelty for complexity. Whoever she became next would have to be stronger, smarter, and infinitely more careful. Because she wasn't running away anymore. She was running toward something Ramirez had tried to erase with cash and cold dismissal. She was running toward becoming a mother. And that, she thought as the highway stretched endlessly before her, was a transformation even a mafia boss couldn't stop. The coastal town of Saltwater Bay had exactly one diner that stayed open past midnight, and Christina had been working there for 6 weeks when her body decided to betray every lie she'd been telling herself. The morning sickness she'd been attributing to stress, and cheap ramen had evolved into something more insistent, more demanding, refusing to be ignored while she balanced plates of hash browns and refilled coffee cups for truckers passing through on their way to somewhere more important. She'd found work the second day after the bus deposited her on a street corner that smelled like brine and fried fish. The Horizon Diner didn't ask questions about references or social security numbers that might be traced back to a city she was trying to forget. The owner, a woman named Dolores with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by anything, simply handed her an apron and told her the evening shift started at 4. That had been 6 weeks ago. Now Christina worked doubles whenever Dolores would let her, stacking dollars and coins in a shoebox under her bed in the efficiency apartment above the hardware store. Every penny was a brick in the wall she was building between her past and whatever future she could scrape together. She'd calculated that at her current rate, she'd have enough for first and last month's rent on a real apartment in 4 months, maybe 5 if she needed to see a doctor. The doctor? That thought had been circling her mind like a shark for days now, ever since her uniform had started feeling tight across her middle, and her ankles had begun swelling during the long shifts. She couldn't avoid it much longer, but every clinic meant paperwork, meant questions, meant leaving a trail that someone with Ramirez's resources might eventually follow. It was Dolores who finally cornered her during the dead zone between breakfast rush and lunch prep, when the diner held only 2 regulars nursing coffee at opposite ends of the counter. Christina was refilling ketchup bottles, a task she'd learned to love for its mindless repetition, when Dolores slid a business card across the stainless steel prep counter. Free clinic, 2 blocks from the boardwalk. They don't care about your story, and they don't keep the kind of records that follow you around. Dolores's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes held something softer, something that suggested she'd maybe been someone's Christina once upon a time. You're what, 3 months along? 4. Christina's hands froze on the ketchup bottle. She hadn't told anyone, had barely acknowledged it to herself beyond the obvious physical evidence accumulating despite her best efforts at denial. I don't, she started, but Dolores cut her off with a wave of her dish rag. Save it. I've been running this place for 32 years. I know what a girl looks like when she's running from something and growing something at the same time. Go today. Your shift doesn't start until 4. The clinic was exactly as advertised. A converted house with peeling paint, and a waiting room full of women who all wore the same expression of quiet determination. The nurse who called her back was younger than Christina expected, with kind hands and a no-nonsense efficiency that made the whole examination feel less invasive than it could have been. When was your last period? The nurse asked, and Christina had to count backward through bus schedules and double shifts and sleepless nights in a stranger's town. Mid-September, maybe. I wasn't regular before stress, I think. The nurse nodded, made notes, then pulled out the portable ultrasound machine with the casual air of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Let's take a look and see how far along you are. This might be cold. The gel was freezing against Christina's skin, and she turned her head away from the screen, not ready to see the evidence made real, made visible. But then the sound filled the small examination room, a rhythmic whooshing that seemed impossibly loud, impossibly fast. There's the heartbeat, the nurse said, her voice warm with professional reassurance. Strong and steady. Now let me just... She paused, moved the wand slightly, and her expression shifted into something Christina couldn't quite read. Oh, well, that explains why you're showing early. Christina's head snapped toward the screen despite her earlier resistance, and what she saw made the room tilt sideways. 2 distinct shapes, 2 separate areas of movement, 2 impossible realities growing inside her body that already felt stretched beyond capacity. Twins, the nurse confirmed, and her smile suggested this was good news, cause for celebration. Both measuring right around 14 weeks, which puts your due date sometime in late May, early June. Everything looks healthy from what I can see here, but you'll want to establish regular prenatal care. Twins require extra monitoring. The words washed over Christina like a wave she hadn't seen coming, pulling her under, drowning her in implications she couldn't process fast enough. One child she'd been preparing for, mentally and emotionally, building a fragile framework of possibility around. One child she could maybe manage, maybe hide, maybe raise in this small town where nobody asked questions. But two was exponential, not additive. Two was twice the risk, twice the visibility, twice the chance that someone would notice, would remember, would connect the dots back to a penthouse office, and a man who'd made it very clear he wanted no part of fatherhood. She made it back to the diner before her shift started, but only barely, her legs operating on autopilot while her mind spiraled through calculations that all ended in impossibility. The efficiency apartment was too small for one person, let alone a woman and 2 infants. Her savings would cover maybe 2 months of formula and diapers, and that was assuming nothing went wrong, assuming she could work up until delivery and return immediately after. The evening shift passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical motions. She dropped a plate during the dinner rush, watching it shatter against the checkerboard linoleum, and Dolores simply handed her a broom without comment. A family came in around 7, mother, father, and twin toddlers who shrieked with laughter while systematically destroying their high chairs, and Christina had to excuse herself to the walk-in freezer to breathe through the panic attack that clawed at her throat. This was real now. Confirmed, measured, growing at a rate she couldn't control or slow down. 2 lives dependent on a woman who was still figuring out how to keep herself alive, how to stay hidden, how to build something from nothing with hands that still shook when she heard certain makes of cars on the street outside. She thought about Ramirez exactly once during her shift, let herself imagine for 30 seconds what he would say if he knew. The image that formed was so visceral it made her nauseous, his face transforming from dismissal to fury at her disobedience, at her refusal to disappear as thoroughly as he'd demanded. He'd said 1 child was unacceptable. 2 would be unforgivable. When the last customer finally left at 11:45, Christina sat in the back booth and counted her tips while Dolores tallied the register. $63 in crumpled bills and loose change. She smoothed each bill carefully, stacked the quarters in neat columns, and let herself do the math she'd been avoiding. At this rate, working doubles 6 days a week, she'd have maybe $800 saved by the time the twins arrived. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was what she had, and somehow, impossibly, it would have to become sufficient. Because those 2 heartbeats, fast and determined and completely oblivious to the magnitude of the life they'd chosen her for, deserved more than a father who'd tried to erase them with cash and a mother who didn't know how to stop running. They deserved someone who would fight. And as Christina walked home through streets that smelled like salt and possibility, she felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with pregnancy and everything to do with purpose. She would become that person. Even if it killed her, even if it meant never stopping, never resting, never letting her guard down for a single moment. 2 lives demanded nothing less than her complete transformation, and Christina Reed had already proven she knew how to disappear. Now, she just had to figure out how to reappear as someone strong enough to protect them both. The blizzard hit Saltwater Bay on a Tuesday in early June, which should have been impossible except that the coastal storm system colliding with an Arctic front apparently didn't care about meteorological probability. Christina had been timing contractions for 6 hours before the first snowflakes started falling, and by the time she accepted that this was actually happening, the world outside her window had transformed into a swirling white void that made the street below disappear completely. She'd planned for this moment with the kind of obsessive detail that had kept her sane through 9 months of paranoia and preparation. The apartment, a real one now, 2 rooms above the bookstore with actual heat and locks that worked, had supplies stacked in careful categories, towels boiled and sealed in plastic bags, scissors sterilized in rubbing alcohol, a list of emergency numbers taped to the wall beside the phone, though calling any of them meant questions she still wasn't ready to answer. Dolores was supposed to be her backup plan, the person who'd promised to drive her to the county hospital 40 minutes inland when the time came. But Dolores was stuck in Portland visiting her daughter, and the hospital might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her now. The contractions were coming every 4 minutes, each one a tightening vice that started in her lower back and wrapped around her entire torso, like her body was trying to turn itself inside out. She'd read about this, studied it in the nursing textbooks she'd been collecting from the library sale bin. Labor was supposed to be manageable in the early stages, something you could breathe through, something that built gradually toward the intense final phase. But her body apparently hadn't read the same books, because each contraction felt like being split open by hands that didn't care about her comfort or her carefully constructed plans. The phone rang at 7:30, and she managed to grab it between contractions, pressing it to her ear with a hand that shook so violently she nearly dropped it. "Christina, it's Dolores. I heard about the storm. Are you—" The older woman's voice cut off as Christina made a sound she'd never heard herself make before, something between a gasp and a growl that came from a place deeper than conscious thought. "I think," Christina managed when she could breathe again, "I think this is happening, now, tonight." The silence on the other end lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Dolores's voice came back, stripped of its usual casual warmth and replaced with the kind of calm that only came from genuine crisis. Okay, listen to me. You're going to do this, you hear me? Women have been doing this in worse situations since the beginning of time. Is your door unlocked?" "Yes, but you can't the storm." "I'm not coming, honey. Roads are already impassable. But I'm calling Violet Torres. She's a retired midwife, lives 3 buildings down from you. She delivered half the bobbies in this town before the hospital opened. She can walk to you even in this mess." Christina wanted to protest, wanted to say that more people knowing meant more risk, more chances for her story to leak beyond the careful boundaries she'd maintained. But another contraction hit, stronger than the last, and all she could do was grip the phone and try not to scream. Violet arrived 23 minutes later, snow-covered and carrying a bag that looked older than Christina herself. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, with brown skin weathered by decades of coastal wind and eyes that assessed Christina's situation in approximately 10 seconds. "How far apart?" she asked, already washing her hands in the kitchen sink with the kind of thorough efficiency that suggested she'd done this thousands of times. 3 minutes, maybe less." Christina was on her hands and knees on the bed now, the only position that made the pain remotely bearable, her forehead pressed against pillows that smelled like the lavender detergent she'd splurged on last month. Violet examined her with gentle but firm hands, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Christina's heart drop. "You're already at 8 centimeters, and I'm feeling 2 distinct heads. You told me you were having twins." "Yes, but they said. The ultrasound said they were both head down, that it should be straightforward." "Straightforward is relative when you're birthing 2 bobbies in a blizzard, honey. But your body knows what to do, even if your mind is panicking. The first one is coming soon, very soon." The next 2 hours existed outside of time, outside of anything Christina had experienced or imagined. The contractions stopped being separate events and became one continuous wave of pressure and pain that obliterated everything except the singular animal instinct to survive this, to get these bobbies out, to reach the other side of this impossible threshold. The apartment disappeared. The blizzard disappeared. The entire world narrowed to Violet's voice giving instructions she followed without conscious thought, her own body doing things that felt both completely foreign and somehow ancestrally familiar. The first baby, the first son, arrived at 10:47 p.m. according to the clock on the wall, though Christina only learned that later. In the moment, there was only the sensation of something releasing, some fundamental shift, and then a sound that cut through her exhaustion like light through fog. Crying. High-pitched and indignant and impossibly, miraculously alive. "It's a boy," Violet said, and Christina could hear the smile in her voice even through the haze of pain and relief. "Perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs like a champion. But we're not done yet, Mama. The second one is coming." The second labor was shorter but somehow more intense, her body already exhausted from the first, but driven by something larger than fatigue. Leo. She'd already decided the first one was Leo, for the strength in his cry, was wrapped and placed on her chest while she pushed through contractions that felt impossibly cruel after already accomplishing the impossible once. Luca arrived 12 minutes after his brother, quieter but no less perfect, his face scrunched in concentration like he was already contemplating the complications of existence. Violet worked with practiced efficiency, clearing airways, cutting cords, checking reflexes and coloring, and all the invisible metrics that separated healthy from crisis. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the small coastal town, piling snow against windows and erasing roads, and making the world beyond Christina's apartment essentially unreachable. But inside, in the small bedroom that smelled like sweat and blood and something indefinably sacred, 3 people who hadn't existed as a unit hours before were learning each other's breathing, each other's warmth, each other's absolute necessity. Christina held her sons, one in each arm, their combined weight somehow both substantial and weightless, and understood for the first time that running had only been the beginning. She'd spent 9 months hiding, preparing, building walls between herself and the man who'd tried to erase them. But walls were defensive structures, passive protections. What she needed now was something different, something fiercer. She needed to become the kind of mother who could look at 2 miracles born in a blizzard and promise them that no empire, no amount of power, no man's rejection could ever diminish their worth or her commitment to keeping them safe. Violet stayed until dawn, until the storm broke and the world outside turned from hostile to merely difficult. Before she left, the older woman placed one weathered hand on Christina's shoulder and squeezed gently. "Those boys have your eyes," she said, "but there's something else in their faces, something intense, you running from their father." Christina's entire body tensed, but Violet simply shook her head. "Don't answer that. Don't tell me anything you don't want repeated. But know this, every woman in this town has a story about running or hiding or surviving something that should have broken her. You're not alone in that, even when you feel like you have to be." When the door closed behind Violet, Christina looked down at Leo and Luca, at their dark eyes that would eventually settle into whatever color genetics had determined, at the unmistakable intensity already visible in their tiny expressions. She saw it too, the echo of their father in the set of their jaws. In something about their features that she couldn't quite name, but recognized with a certainty that made her chest tight. But she also saw herself. Saw her determination, her refusal to disappear, her absolute conviction that love was stronger than dismissal and worth more than any amount of blood money. The blizzard had passed. Her sons were breathing. And Christina Reed had survived the night that transformed her from a woman in hiding into a mother with everything to protect and nothing left to lose. The penthouse office felt larger than it used to, though nothing about the dimensions had changed. Dominic Ramirez stood at the same floor-to-ceiling windows where he'd dismissed Christina Reed 3 years ago, staring at the same city sprawled below like scattered diamonds. But the view had lost whatever meaning it once held. Power was supposed to fill spaces. Instead, it seemed to create them. Vast, echoing rooms inside his chest where something vital used to exist before he'd traded it for control. His father would have been proud of the empire Dominic had built in those 3 years. The Ramirez syndicate now controlled 70% of the city's port traffic, had judges and city council members on retainer, and operated with the kind of impunity that came from being too connected to touch. On paper, in the ledgers his accountant kept in encrypted files, Dominic was worth more than his father had ever dreamed possible. On paper, he was winning. In reality, he was rotting from the inside out. It started with small things, insubordination disguised as initiative, delays in payments that his lieutenants blamed on market complications, whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. Dominic had been raised in this world, trained from childhood to read the subtle shifts that preceded betrayal, but knowing a coup was building and having the energy to stop it were apparently 2 different things. His right hand, a man named Vincent Calabrese, who'd served his father for 20 years before transferring that loyalty to Dominic, was the one who finally forced the conversation Dominic had been avoiding. Vincent walked into the office without knocking, a liberty that would have gotten anyone else killed, and dropped a folder on the desk with enough force to make the whiskey glass jump. "We have a problem," Vincent said, his voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from watching someone self-destruct in slow motion. 3 of our dock supervisors are skimming. 2 of your runners are working for the Kozlov organization on the side. And your cousin Dante is telling anyone who will listen that you've gone soft, that you're distracted, that maybe it's time for new leadership. Dominic didn't open the folder. He'd received similar reports for months now, each one documenting another crack in the foundation, another symptom of an organization that sensed weakness in its apex predator. "Handle it," he said, the words automatic, empty. "I've been handling it. For 2 years, I've been putting out fires and making excuses and telling people that you're playing a long game they're too stupid to understand." Vincent's hands were flat on the desk now, his body language a challenge that would have been unthinkable in his father's time. "But I can't fix whatever's broken in you, Dom. That's not in my job description." The truth was that Dominic didn't know what was broken either, only that something fundamental had shifted the night. He'd pushed that envelope across the table and watched Christina walk away without taking it. He'd told himself it was the right decision, the only decision. His world had no room for softness, for weakness, for the kind of liability a pregnant maid represented. He'd been protecting both of them, really, sparing her from a life of looking over her shoulder, and sparing himself from the distraction of caring about someone who could be used against him. That's what he'd told himself for 3 years. But the justification wore thinner each day, revealing something underneath that looked uncomfortably like regret. He'd tried to find her, of course. Not immediately. His pride had required at least 6 months before he'd admitted to wanting to know if she'd followed his advice, if she'd used the money he'd eventually had delivered to her apartment, only to discover she'd vanished without taking a single bill. The search had been thorough, professional, utilizing resources that should have been able to locate anyone anywhere. But Christina Reed had disappeared more completely than people with actual criminal experience, leaving no paper trail, no credit card transactions, no forwarding address or emergency contacts. It was almost impressive how thoroughly she'd erased herself, almost infuriating. He told himself he just wanted closure, wanted to know she was safe, wanted to confirm that the decision he'd made had been for the best. But late at night, in the same penthouse where he'd destroyed whatever chance they'd had, Dominic acknowledged a truth he'd never speak aloud. He wanted to see her again, to explain, to somehow undo the look on her face when he'd called their child, their connection, something to be eliminated. The empire his father built had been ruthless but coherent, driven by clear principles even if those principles were morally bankrupt. What Dominic had created was something different, something that felt increasingly like a machine running on momentum alone, grinding forward, because stopping would mean examining why it existed in the first place. Vincent was still standing across the desk, waiting for a response that went deeper than empty directives. Dominic finally met his eyes and saw something there that cut through the numbness: disappointment. Not anger or fear or calculation, but the specific disappointment of watching potential curdle into waste. "What do you want me to say?" Dominic asked, and hated how the question sounded like surrender. "I want you to tell me what happened to the man who used to give a damn about this organization. The one who could walk into a room and make grown men reconsider their life choices just by existing. You've got all the pieces, the money, the connections, the fear, but you're missing the one thing that actually holds an empire together. Which is the belief that it matters, that what you're building means something beyond the next quarterly profit or the next territory claimed." Vincent picked up the folder he'd dropped, held it for a moment like he was debating whether to bother, then tossed it in the trash instead. "Your father was a bastard, but he believed in the family, in the legacy, in something larger than himself. I don't know what you believe in anymore, and neither does anyone else. That's why they're circling." After Vincent left, Dominic opened his desk drawer and pulled out the single photograph he'd kept from that time in his life. It wasn't of Christina. He'd never allowed photographs, had been too paranoid about documentation, but of the penthouse hallway where he'd first seen her. Someone had left a mop bucket in the frame, abandoned mid-shift, and for reasons he couldn't articulate, he'd had the image printed and filed away. He looked at it now and tried to remember what he'd felt in those early days, before paranoia and responsibility had calcified into the kind of coldness that pushed away anything resembling genuine connection. He tried to remember what Christina's laugh sounded like, how her hands had trembled the first time he'd kissed her in the service elevator, the way she'd looked at him like he was a person rather than a position. The city glittered below, indifferent to his crisis of meaning, and Dominic made a decision that would have horrified his father and probably should have horrified him. He was going to find her. Not to reclaim anything or to assert ownership over a child he'd rejected, but because somewhere in the hollow architecture of his empire, he'd lost the ability to feel anything except the absence of what he'd thrown away. Power was supposed to be enough. Control was supposed to fill the spaces. But standing in an office that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, surrounded by evidence of influence and success, Dominic Ramirez felt nothing except the ghost of a woman who'd walked away without his blood money and somehow taken every shred of his purpose with her. Outside his window, the city continued its indifferent rotation, and somewhere in its sprawl or beyond it, Christina Reed existed with no awareness that the man who tried to erase her was slowly being erased himself, not by rivals or bullets, but by the rot that came from building an empire on foundations of dismissal and discovering too late that some things couldn't be controlled or conquered, only mourned. The Harbor Heights Grand Hotel had hosted charity galas every spring for the past 47 years, and Christina had been managing the catering for the last 2. It was good work, demanding but well paid, the kind of position that came with health insurance and a retirement account and all the markers of stability she'd fought tooth and nail to achieve. The irony of spending her evenings serving champagne to the wealthy while her sons slept in their shared bedroom 3 miles away wasn't lost on her. But irony didn't pay for Leo's asthma medication or Luca's speech therapy sessions. Tonight's event was particularly high profile, something about coastal development and urban renewal that translated to real estate developers and city politicians pretending to care about affordable housing while writing checks that would ensure the opposite. Christina didn't pay much attention to the guest list anymore. Her job was to make sure the past hors d'oeuvres circulated efficiently and the bar stayed stocked, and the servers didn't accidentally dump champagne on anyone who could make her life difficult. She'd learned to move through these events like a ghost, visible enough to manage her team, but invisible enough that the guests never really saw her as a person. It was a skill she'd perfected over 3 years of service industry work, this ability to be present and absent simultaneously, and it served her well in a world where being noticed often meant being vulnerable. The ballroom was already half full when she did her final check of the buffet stations, adjusting the height of a flower arrangement that was blocking the shrimp display, making sure the warming lamps were at the correct temperature. Her team was solid tonight, experienced servers who knew how to read a room, who understood that their job was to facilitate the party without becoming part of it. She just finished briefing them on the VIP section, timing when her assistant manager, a sharp woman named Brianna, appeared at her elbow with a tablet and an expression Christina had learned to dread. "We have a late addition to the VIP list," Brianna said, scrolling through what looked like an email chain that had gotten heated. "Some big developer from the city. His assistant called an hour ago demanding we accommodate his dietary restrictions and security requirements. The hotel management is bending over backward, so we need to do the same." Christina took the tablet, scanning the requirements with professional detachment. No shellfish, whiskey instead of wine, specific placement away from windows and near exits. Standard paranoid rich person stuff, the kind of demands she'd handled dozens of times. The name at the top of the document was printed in bold: Dominic Ramirez, Ramirez Development Corporation. The tablet slipped from her hands. She caught it before it hit the floor, but Brianna noticed the fumble, the sudden pallor that Christina could feel draining from her face like someone had opened a valve. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Christina managed, but her voice sounded distant, filtered through water or time or the 3 years she'd spent constructing a life specifically designed to never intersect with this moment. "Just give me 5 minutes. I need to check on something in the kitchen." The bathroom was her actual destination, the single occupancy one near the service entrance that the staff used when they needed to break down without witnesses. She locked the door and gripped the edges of the sink, staring at her reflection, and trying to reconcile the woman she'd become with the woman she'd been the last time Dominic Ramirez had looked at her. That woman had been on her knees with soapy water dripping from her gloves, trembling and pregnant and stupid enough to believe that love could exist in the spaces between power and cruelty. This woman wore a tailored black suit that she'd saved for 3 months to afford, had a business card with catering manager printed under her name, and could look herself in the eye without flinching. But this woman also had 2 3-year-old boys at home, with dark eyes and stubborn jaws that she saw in the mirror every time she looked at them. And the thought of Dominic Ramirez being in the same building as any evidence of their existence made her hands shake so violently she had to run them under cold water to regain control. She couldn't avoid the ballroom. Her job required her to be visible, to circulate, to ensure everything ran smoothly. But she could be strategic about it, could position herself in the sections furthest from the VIP area, could trust her team to handle anything that arose near his table. She'd spent 3 years mastering the art of invisibility. She could manage one more night. The plan worked perfectly for exactly 43 minutes. Christina stayed in the periphery, managing a small crisis with the dessert display and mediating a dispute between 2 servers about section assignments. She kept her head down, her movements efficient, her attention focused on anything except the VIP section, where Dominic Ramirez presumably sat among the other predators pretending to care about community welfare. Then Brianna appeared again, this time with actual panic in her eyes. The VIP server just quit, like walked out mid-shift. Something about the guests being degrading. I need you to cover that section until I can pull someone from the main floor. Christina's entire body went cold. Get someone else, anyone else. Pull from the coat check if you have to. There is no one else. Everyone's assigned, and you know that section requires someone with actual experience. It's 15 minutes, Christina. Just keep their drinks filled and smile. You've done this 1,000 times. She had done this 1,000 times, but never with the specific knowledge that the man who tried to erase her existence would be watching, would potentially recognize her, would have the power to destroy everything she'd built with a single phone call to whoever controlled immigration databases, or background checks, or any of the 100 other systems that could reveal she'd been working under a social security number that didn't quite match her claimed identity. But refusing would raise questions she couldn't answer without revealing too much. So Christina straightened her jacket, grabbed a champagne bottle from the bar, and walked toward the VIP section with the kind of calm that only came from absolute terror masked by years of practice. The section was exactly as insufferable as she'd expected. Men in suits that cost more than her monthly rent, women with jewelry that could fund a small country's infrastructure, all of them engaged in the kind of conversation that was really just verbal peacocking disguised as philanthropy. She moved between tables with mechanical precision, refilling glasses, removing empty plates, becoming part of the scenery. She'd almost made it through without incident when she felt it, the weight of someone's attention, different from the casual glances of people who saw servers as animated furniture. This was focused, intense, the kind of stare that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up in warning. Christina turned, champagne bottle still in hand, and looked directly into the eyes of Dominic Ramirez for the first time in 3 years. He'd aged, but not in ways that diminished him. If anything, the sharp edges had grown sharper, the intensity more concentrated. He sat at a table with 3 other men who were still talking, still gesturing with their cigars and their glasses, completely oblivious to the fact that their companion had gone absolutely still. For approximately 5 seconds, neither of them moved. Christina watched recognition dawn in his expression, confusion first, then shock, then something she couldn't quite identify, but that looked uncomfortably like relief. His mouth opened like he was about to say her name, about to shatter the careful invisibility she'd constructed. She turned and walked away. Not running. Running would draw attention, would create a scene. But her stride was purposeful, final, carrying her across the ballroom and through the service entrance and into the kitchen where her team couldn't see her face as it crumbled into something between terror and rage. He'd seen her. After 3 years of careful hiding, of building a life in the shadows, of becoming someone he would never think to look for. Dominic Ramirez had looked directly at her and known exactly who she was. And judging by the expression on his face, by the way he'd half risen from his chair before she'd turned away, he had no intention of pretending otherwise. Christina made it exactly 18 hours before Dominic Ramirez appeared at the Horizon Diner during the Tuesday lunch rush. She saw him through the window first, the black Mercedes that was too sleek, too expensive, too deliberately out of place in a coastal town where most people drove trucks held together by rust and prayer. Her hands froze on the coffee pot she'd been holding, hot liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim as every instinct she'd honed over 3 years started screaming at her to run. But she couldn't run. Not anymore. Not with Leo and Lucas at the community daycare 2 blocks away, not with a life she'd built that had roots and connections and people who knew her face. Running now would mean abandoning everything, and the woman she'd become was done abandoning things that mattered. Dolores noticed her paralysis and followed her gaze to the window. "That's trouble," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen enough trouble to recognize it on sight. "Want me to tell him we're at capacity?" "No," Christina heard herself say, though her brain was still several seconds behind her mouth. "I'll handle it." Dominic walked in like he owned the place, which was probably how he walked into every space, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, never being refused entry, never having to wonder if he belonged. He'd traded the expensive suit from the gala for dark jeans and a leather jacket that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but the clothing change didn't make him look less dangerous. If anything, it made him look more present, more real, like a predator who decided to stop pretending to be civilized. His eyes found her immediately, and Christina watched him take in her appearance with an intensity that felt invasive. The simple uniform with the diner's logo, the ponytail she'd pulled her hair into during the morning rush, the complete absence of the polished catering manager from the night before. She could see him calculating, reassessing, trying to reconcile the woman who'd scrubbed his floors with the woman who'd managed a high-end event with professional precision. "We need to talk," he said, his voice pitched low enough that the other customers couldn't hear, but loud enough to carry the weight of a command rather than a request. "I'm working." Christina kept her own voice level, professional, treating him exactly like she'd treat any customer who'd walked in demanding her immediate attention. "You can order something or you can leave. Those are your options." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the kind of frustration that came from expecting compliance and receiving resistance instead. But he slid into the booth in the corner, the one with the clear view of both entrances that she should have known he'd choose, and picked up the laminated menu like he was actually considering the Tuesday special. Christina took her time approaching his table, stopping to refill coffee for her regulars, to joke with old Mr. Patterson about his crossword puzzle, to do all the normal things that made up her normal life in this normal town that had nothing to do with men in Mercedes who looked at her like she was unfinished business. When she finally reached his booth, order pad in hand, she didn't sit. "What can I get you?" "Answers," Dominic said. "Coffee in that order." She poured his coffee without responding, her hand steady despite the chaos rioting through her nervous system. He caught her wrist as she turned to leave, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop her momentum, and the contact sent electricity shooting up her arm that felt like memory and warning combined. "Don't," she said quietly, and something in her tone made him release her immediately. 3 years, Christina. You disappeared for 3 years without a trace. Do you have any idea?" He stopped himself, ran a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd never seen him make before, something that looked almost like vulnerability. "I looked for you, everywhere. I needed to know you were okay." The laugh that escaped her was sharp enough to cut. "You needed to know I was okay? After you told me to get rid of it? After you threw money at me like I was a problem to be solved?" She was aware of her voice rising slightly, aware of Dolores watching from behind the counter with the protective intensity of a mother bear. "I was more than okay. I was free." "You kept it," he said, and the statement wasn't a question but rather a realization spoken aloud, something he'd already concluded based on evidence she couldn't identify. "The baby. You kept it." Christina's blood turned to ice. "That's none of your business." "The hell it's not. If there's a child, my child." He was standing now, and the movement brought him close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "I have a right to know." "You gave up any rights you had when you handed me that envelope." Christina stepped back, creating distance, creating safety. "I don't owe you anything. Not information, not access, not." The door chimed, and Christina's entire world stopped rotating. Violet Torres walked in with Leo and Luca trailing behind her, their small hands clutched in hers as they chattered about something involving dinosaurs and snack time. The retired midwife sometimes picked them up from daycare when Christina's shift ran long, a kindness that had become routine enough that the boys bounded toward the diner like it was an adventure rather than a necessity. "Mama!" Leo shouted, his voice carrying across the diner with the kind of volume that only 3-year-olds could achieve. He broke free from Violet's grip and ran toward Christina with Luca right behind him, both of them moving with the kind of coordinated chaos that came from being twins who'd shared a womb and a bedroom and every significant moment of their short lives. Christina felt the moment like a physical blow, the realization that she couldn't stop this, couldn't prevent what was about to happen, couldn't do anything except watch as 3 years of careful hiding detonated in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She caught Leo as he collided with her legs, scooped Luca up with her other arm, and turned to face Dominic Ramirez with both of her sons in her embrace like shields or declarations or both. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like he might actually collapse. His eyes moved from Christina to the boys and back again, and she watched him see it. The unmistakable evidence written in their features, in the dark eyes that mirrored his own, in the stubborn set of their jaws, in the intensity that radiated from them even at 3 years old. "Two," he said, and his voice sounded strangled, compressed by something larger than shock. "There are 2 of them." "Go," Christina said, and her voice shook but held. "Get out of here, now." But Dominic didn't move. He stood frozen in the middle of the Horizon diner, staring at 2 small boys who had no idea they were looking at their father, who were already squirming in Christina's arms and asking about the French fries they'd been promised. His hand came up like he wanted to reach toward them, then dropped back to his side like he'd realized he had no right to that gesture. Luca, who'd always been more observant than his brother, tilted his head and studied Dominic with the kind of focus that made him seem older than his years. "Why is that man crying?" he asked Christina, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. Christina looked at Dominic's face and saw that Luca was right. There were tears tracking down his cheeks, silent and apparently unconscious, the kind of crying that happened when someone's entire understanding of reality shifted beneath their feet. "I don't know, baby," she said, though she knew exactly why. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they see something beautiful." Dominic made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob or something in between. Then he turned and walked out of the diner without another word, leaving behind a coffee he hadn't drunk and a silence that felt heavier than any conversation could have been. Through the window, Christina watched him sit in his Mercedes for a full 5 minutes, his head bowed against the steering wheel, his shoulders shaking with what she desperately hoped was the beginning of understanding that some things, some lives, couldn't be controlled or claimed or corrected with money and second chances. Violet appeared at her elbow, her weathered hand gentle on Christina's shoulder. "That's their father," she said quietly, and it wasn't a question. "That's the man who told me to get rid of them," Christina corrected, setting the boys down and watching them scramble toward the booth where their coloring books waited. "Those aren't the same thing." But as Dominic's car finally pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the coastal afternoon, Christina acknowledged a truth she'd been avoiding since the moment their eyes met across the ballroom. He'd found them. And judging by the devastation she'd seen in his expression, by the tears he hadn't bothered to hide, he wasn't going to walk away a second time. The only question was whether she'd let him stay. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday, which was the first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong because nobody called at 2:47 a.m. with good news. Christina fumbled for her phone in the darkness, her heart already racing with the kind of maternal panic that lived just beneath the surface of every peaceful moment, always ready to detonate at the slightest provocation. "Ms. Reed," the voice was unfamiliar male, with an accent she couldn't place. "You don't know me, but I know you. More importantly, I know who your son's father is, and I have something he wants very badly." Christina was out of bed before her conscious mind caught up with her body, moving down the hallway toward the boy's room with the phone pressed to her ear and terror climbing up her throat like bile. The door was open when it should have been closed. The nightlight was on, casting its soft glow over 2 empty beds with sheets thrown back and stuffed animals abandoned on pillows that still held the impression of small heads. The sound that came out of her was something between a scream and a whimper, animal and raw and completely devoid of the control she'd spent 3 years cultivating. She tore through the apartment like the boys might be hiding in closets or under furniture, like this might be some elaborate nightmare she could wake herself from through sheer force of will. "They're not there," the voice continued, calm and almost apologetic. "They're safe for now, sleeping actually. We gave them something mild to keep them comfortable during transport. I'm not a monster, Ms. Reed. I don't hurt children unnecessarily." "Where are they?" Christina's voice cracked on the words, splintered into something she barely recognized. "What do you want?" "I want Dominic Ramirez to understand that his empire has vulnerabilities he can't protect. I want him to feel what it's like to lose something that matters, and I want you to deliver a message for me." The address he gave her was in the city, a warehouse district she vaguely remembered from her time scrubbing Dominic's floors and overhearing conversations about territory disputes and shipping routes. The instructions were simple: come alone, tell Ramirez where to find his sons, and disappear before the real negotiation began. She was a messenger, nothing more. Her role would end the moment she delivered the information. Christina didn't believe a single word of that, but she also didn't have choices anymore. The woman who'd fled the city 3 years ago had been running to protect an abstract future, a possibility of life. The woman who threw on clothes and grabbed her car keys at 3 a.m. was running toward the concrete reality of 2 3-year-old boys who needed their mother more than she needed pride or safety or any of the carefully constructed boundaries she'd built. The drive to the city took 90 minutes that felt like 90 hours. She tried Dominic's number 6 times, the number she'd found in his wallet 3 years ago and memorized despite telling herself she'd never use it. But every call went straight to voicemail. She tried the main line for Ramirez Development Corporation and got an after-hours recording. She even tried calling the Harbor Heights Grand Hotel and asking if they had contact information for VIP guests. But that conversation ended with a polite suggestion that she seek mental health services. The warehouse district looked exactly like every crime scene from every movie she'd ever watched: abandoned buildings with broken windows, streets that hadn't seen maintenance in decades, the kind of darkness that felt intentional rather than accidental. Christina parked 3 blocks away from the address she'd been given, her hands shaking so violently she could barely turn off the ignition. She'd expected to find the warehouse empty, to discover this was all some elaborate hoax designed to torture her. Instead, she found Dominic's Mercedes already parked outside, and through a gap in the loading dock doors, she could see lights and movement and the unmistakable silhouette of the man who'd somehow gotten here before her. He turned when she approached, and the expression on his face was something she'd never seen before, raw fear barely contained by fury, like he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. "How did you?" he started, then shook his head. "They called you too. They told me to deliver a message, to tell you where to find your sons." Christina's voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "But you already know. How did you?" "I have people watching you." He said it like a confession, like an admission of guilt. "Since I saw you at the gala, I needed to know you were safe, that they were." He stopped, ran both hands through his hair in that gesture she was learning meant his control was slipping. "The men watching your apartment reported the break-in immediately. I've been here for 20 minutes trying to figure out how to get inside without getting them killed." The warehouse stretched before them like a mouth full of broken teeth, metal beams and shipping containers, and enough shadows to hide an army. Christina could hear voices coming from somewhere deep inside, could see the glow of what looked like portable lights creating pockets of illumination in the darkness. "This is the Kozlov organization," Dominic said, his voice tight with something that sounded like self-recrimination. "Russian syndicate that's been trying to move into my territory for 2 years. I thought I had them contained, thought my security was tight enough that they couldn't touch anything that mattered." He looked at Christina with an expression that might have been apology or anguish or both. "I never thought they'd find out about the boys. I never thought my past mistakes would become their vulnerability." "Your past mistakes?" Christina's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. "You mean me? You mean the children you told me to get rid of?" "I mean every decision I've made since the day I met you." Dominic pulled a gun from somewhere inside his jacket, checked the magazine with practiced efficiency. "I'm going in. You need to leave. Get back in your car and drive until you hit the coast and don't stop until—" "I'm not leaving without my sons." "Our sons," he corrected, and the possessive pronoun hit her like a physical blow. "And you're not going in there. This is my world, my mess, my—" The explosion cut him off mid-sentence, a concussive blast from inside the warehouse that sent flame and smoke billowing through the loading dock doors. Christina felt herself knocked backward, felt Dominic's arm around her waist, pulling her down behind the Mercedes as debris rained around them like apocalyptic hail. When the ringing in her ears subsided enough to hear, there was screaming coming from inside the warehouse, men's voices shouting in what sounded like Russian, the crackle of flames, and underneath it all, a sound that made Christina's entire world narrow to a single point of focus: a child crying. She was moving before conscious thought engaged, running toward the warehouse entrance with Dominic shouting behind her, his hand grasping at her jacket and missing. The heat hit her like a wall, smoke already thick enough to make breathing an act of will, but she could hear them now, both of them, Leo's voice calling for her with the kind of terror that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. Dominic caught up to her 3 steps inside, and instead of pulling her back, he moved ahead, his body between her and whatever danger lurked in the smoke-filled darkness. They navigated by sound and instinct, following the boys' voices through a maze of shipping containers and collapsed scaffolding and flames that licked at the ceiling like hungry predators. She found them in a corner office that had somehow escaped the worst of the explosion. Leo and Luca huddled together in a metal cage that looked designed for something larger than children, their faces streaked with tears and soot, their eyes wide with terror that transformed into desperate hope when they saw her. "Mama!" they screamed in unison, and Christina was at the cage door before she registered that it was locked, her hands tearing at the metal with strength born from pure maternal fury. Dominic was beside her with some kind of tool she didn't recognize, working the lock with fingers that moved with surprising steadiness, considering the warehouse was actively burning around them. The mechanism gave with a metallic shriek, and Christina had both boys in her arms in the space between one breath and the next, their small bodies trembling against hers as they sobbed into her shoulders. "We have to move," Dominic said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The fire is spreading and the structure isn't stable. Follow me and don't stop for anything." The journey back out was a blur of heat and smoke and Dominic's broad back, clearing a path through debris that would have killed them. Christina carried both boys despite their combined weight being nearly impossible to manage, fueled by adrenaline and love, and the absolute certainty that she would die before she let anything happen to them. They burst through the loading dock doors into air that felt like ice in comparison, and Christina kept running until they'd cleared the building by a full block. Only then did she allow herself to collapse onto the pavement, still clutching Leo and Luca, who were now crying for different reasons. Relief, confusion, the aftershock of trauma they were too young to process. Behind them, the warehouse groaned like a dying creature, and Christina watched part of the roof cave in with a shower of sparks that lit up the night sky. Sirens were approaching from multiple directions: police, fire, probably ambulances. Dominic stood between her and the burning building, phone pressed to his ear, giving instructions to someone in the clipped tone of a man used to being obeyed even when his world was burning. When he finally ended the call and turned to face her, his expression carried the weight of someone who just watched every assumption about his life prove catastrophically wrong. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words sounded like they cost him everything. "For all of it. For 3 years ago, for not protecting them, for—" "Don't," Christina interrupted, her voice hoarse from smoke and screaming. "Don't apologize, just tell me this ends. Tell me they'll be safe." Dominic looked at the burning warehouse, at the approaching emergency vehicles, at the 2 small boys who'd finally stopped crying and were staring at him with identical expressions of exhausted confusion. "It ends," he said. "I promise you, Christina. Whatever I have to do, whoever I have to destroy, this ends tonight." The hospital kept Leo and Luca for observation through the night and into the following morning, monitoring them for smoke inhalation and whatever sedative the Kozlov organization had used to keep them compliant during the kidnapping. Christina refused to leave their bedside, sitting between their beds with a hand on each of them, needing the physical confirmation that they were breathing, that they were real, that the nightmare had ended even though her body still vibrated with residual terror. Dominic disappeared around dawn, and Christina told herself she was relieved by his absence, that having him gone made it easier to breathe, easier to pretend the last 12 hours had been an aberration, rather than a preview of what life would look like if she allowed him any permanent proximity to their sons. But when he returned 6 hours later, something fundamental had shifted in his appearance. Not his clothes, which were still smoke-stained and torn, but something deeper, something that showed in the set of his shoulders and the shadows under his eyes. "Can we talk?" he asked from the doorway, his voice careful, like he was approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at sudden movements. Christina looked at Leo and Luca, both finally sleeping peacefully after a morning of doctors and questions and popsicles from sympathetic nurses. She kissed each of their foreheads, then followed Dominic into the hallway, keeping the door cracked so she could still see them, so she could run back the moment either of them stirred. "I met with the Kozlov leadership 3 hours ago," Dominic said without preamble, leaning against the wall like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "What's left of it, anyway? Turns out the warehouse explosion killed their second-in-command and 2 of their primary enforcers. The man who ordered the kidnapping, Alexei Kozlov, is currently in ICU downstairs with burns over 40% of his body." Christina waited, saying nothing, offering him no reaction to work with. "I made them a deal." Dominic's hands were in his pockets, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the muscle that jumped when he was controlling something volatile. "They get my territories, all of them. The port operations, the shipping contracts, the political connections, everything I've spent 15 years building. In exchange, they leave this town alone. They never come within 100 miles of you or the boys. They erase any documentation of last night from every database they control." The words hung in the sterile hospital air between them, and Christina tried to process what he was actually saying, what he was actually offering. "Your territories, your entire empire." "It's not an empire if I can't protect what matters." Dominic's laugh was bitter, self-directed. "My father spent 30 years building that organization. He'd probably rise from his grave to kill me himself if he knew I'd traded it all for 2 children he never knew existed. But my father was wrong about a lot of things, including what actually constitutes power." Christina crossed her arms, a physical barrier against the strange pull of his words, against the dangerous temptation to believe this was real rather than temporary emotion born from crisis. "You think giving up your criminal organization makes you a good person, makes you someone who deserves access to them?" "No," he said simply. "I think it makes me someone who's finally figured out the difference between what I wanted and what I actually need. But it's not just the Kozlov deal, Christina. I met with Vincent this morning, my right hand, the man who's kept my organization functional for the last 2 years while I've been slowly imploding. I'm signing everything over to him. The legitimate businesses, the development corporation, all of it. He'll run it better than I ever did anyway." "Why?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with the suspicion that came from 3 years of trusting no one, of assuming every kindness had an angle. "Why now, after 3 years of not caring, of building your empire on the same cruelty that tried to erase us?" Dominic pushed off the wall, took a step toward her, then stopped like he'd remembered he didn't have the right to invade her space anymore. Because I saw them. I saw Leo trying to protect his brother even though he was terrified, saw Luca watching everything with those eyes that are exactly like mine, and I understood something I've been avoiding since the day I handed you that envelope. I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too much of a coward to admit that power and control were just expensive ways of staying empty. Through the cracked door, Christina could see Luca stirring, his small hand reaching for his brother in sleep, finding Leo's arm and settling back into unconsciousness with the kind of trust that only existed between people who'd shared everything since conception. She thought about the last 3 years, the double shifts and the efficiency apartment and the terror of every unexpected knock on the door, and recognized that it had all been worth it for moments exactly like this one, where her sons had each other and knew they were loved without condition or calculation. "You can't just buy your way into their lives," she said, turning back to Dominic with something that felt like the last intact piece of her armor. "You can't dismantle your empire and expect that to erase what you said to me, what you tried to make me do." "I know," he said, and the admission sounded like it cost him everything. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for a place in their lives or yours. I'm asking for the chance to make sure last night never happens again, to use whatever resources I still have to build something around you that's actually protective instead of destructive." A nurse walked past them with a medication cart, glancing at Christina with the kind of sympathy reserved for people clearly navigating impossible situations. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, and somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped with the steady rhythm of someone's heartbeat continuing despite all odds. "I need guarantees," Christina heard herself say, though part of her couldn't believe she was even considering this. "I need to know that your world won't touch them, won't follow them, won't turn their childhood into the kind of nightmare we just lived through. I'll put it in writing. Legal documents, trust funds they can't touch until they're adults, property deeds in your name for houses in towns where nobody knows the Ramirez name." Dominic was speaking faster now, like he was afraid she'd change her mind before he finished. "I'll hire security that reports to you, not me. I'll move to whatever city you choose and keep whatever distance you require. I'll—" "Stop," Christina interrupted, her hand raised between them. "Stop making promises you might not be able to keep. Just answer one question honestly. Why should I believe that the man who told me to get rid of it has actually changed?" Dominic was silent for a long moment, his expression cycling through options and discarding them, searching for truth in a situation where truth was the only currency that mattered. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of something that sounded like hard-won self-awareness. "You shouldn't believe it," he said. "Not based on what I'm saying now, when I'm desperate and scared and still smelling like smoke from a warehouse that nearly killed our children. You should watch what I do over the next month, the next year, the next decade. You should make me prove it through action instead of accepting it through words. Because words are what I gave you 3 years ago, promises about building something real, about escape, about seeing you as more than what you did for a living. And then I destroyed all of it the moment it became inconvenient." Through the door, Leo made a small sound, and Christina's body moved toward it instinctively before she registered that he just shifted in sleep rather than waking. The maternal pull was physical, undeniable, stronger than any argument or promise or carefully constructed defense. "I need time," she said finally, her eyes still on her sons. "I need to think about what's actually best for them, not what feels redemptive or dramatic or like the ending to some story where the villain becomes the hero. Real life doesn't work like that. Real transformation takes longer than one grand gesture." "I know," Dominic said. "Take whatever time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk, or I'll disappear completely if that's what you decide they need. But Christina—" He waited until she looked at him, until their eyes met with the kind of honesty that had been missing 3 years ago. "I was wrong. About everything. About what mattered, about who deserved respect, about whether love was weakness or the only thing that actually made strength mean something. You were never invisible to me. You were terrifying, because you made me feel human in a world where I'd spent my whole life learning to feel nothing. He left before she could respond, walking down the hospital corridor with the posture of someone who just handed over everything and wasn't sure whether that made him liberated or destroyed. Christina watched him go, then returned to her vigil between her son's beds, her hands finding theirs again, anchoring herself to the only truth that mattered. They were safe, they were hers, and whatever decision she made about Dominic Ramirez would be based on what protected them rather than what healed her. The empire he'd built on cruelty and control was gone, traded for two small boys who didn't know their father had once tried to erase them from existence. Whether that trade represented genuine transformation or just expensive regret remained to be seen. But for the first time in 3 years, Christina allowed herself to consider the possibility that some people actually learned from their worst mistakes, instead of just repeating them with better justifications. Time would tell which category Dominic Ramirez belonged to. 6 months after the warehouse fire, Christina stood in the kitchen of a house she actually owned. Not rented, not borrowed, but owned with her name on the deed and a mortgage that had been mysteriously paid in full before she'd even signed the paperwork. Watching Leo and Luca demolish peanut butter sandwiches with the kind of concentrated enthusiasm they brought to everything. The house sat 3 blocks from the ocean in a town even smaller than Saltwater Bay, a place where the most exciting local news involved disputed property lines and the annual clam festival. It was exactly the kind of anonymous safety she'd been searching for 3 years ago, when she'd fled the city on a bus that smelled like diesel and desperation. "Can we go to the beach?" Leo asked through a mouthful of sandwich, his dark eyes already calculating whether asking nicely would override the rule about finishing lunch first. "After you eat actual vegetables," Christina countered, sliding carrot sticks onto both their plates and watching their matching expressions of betrayal. "And after nap time." The negotiation that followed was pure theater. Both boys knew they'd end up at the beach eventually, just as Christina knew she'd give them an extra 15 minutes in the water because their joy was the kind of currency she'd never learned to resist. This was the life she'd built. Predictable, peaceful, constructed entirely around 2 small humans who thought the height of adventure was finding intact sand dollars and racing hermit crabs. It was also the life that Dominic Ramirez had been financing from a careful distance, never asking for acknowledgement, never demanding the access his money theoretically bought him. He'd kept every promise he'd made in that hospital hallway. The legal documents had appeared within a week, trust funds locked until the boys turned 25, property deeds with no strings attached, life insurance policies that named Christina as the sole beneficiary. The security he'd mentioned was so subtle she'd only noticed it after the 3rd week, when she'd realized the same nondescript sedan was always parked within view of the house, changing drivers but never location. When she'd called the number he'd given her, the only time she'd used it in 6 months, to demand an explanation, his response had been characteristically direct. "They're not watching you. They're watching for anyone who might be watching you. You'll never see them unless there's a problem, and if there's a problem, you'll be grateful they exist." She'd wanted to argue, to insist she didn't need his protection or his money, or his continued presence in the architecture of her life. But Leo had been recovering from a particularly bad asthma attack that week, and the inhaler prescription that should have cost $300 had somehow been covered by insurance she didn't remember having, and her righteous anger had deflated into something more complicated. After nap time, which Luca actually slept through while Leo pretended with his eyes squeezed shut and his body vibrating with poorly suppressed energy, they walked the 3 blocks to the beach. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, the kind of day when most people were at work or school, leaving the sand relatively empty except for a few dedicated joggers and an elderly couple walking a dog that looked older than Christina felt. The boys hit the water like they'd been released from captivity, shrieking at the cold and immediately demanding to go deeper despite the waves being large enough to knock them over. Christina waded in after them, jeans rolled to her knees, hands ready to catch whichever twin inevitably misjudged the surf. She didn't notice Dominic until she'd been there for 20 minutes, until she turned to grab the beach bag and saw him sitting on a piece of driftwood about 50 yards up the shore. He wasn't hiding. His black jacket, and dark jeans stood out against the weathered wood and pale sand. But he wasn't approaching either, maintaining the exact distance she'd requested in the single email she'd sent him 2 months ago when Leo had asked why some kids had daddies and they didn't. Her first instinct was anger at the presumption, at his presence in a space she'd claimed as theirs. But watching him watch the boys, his posture carefully neutral, his hands shoved in his pockets like he was physically restraining himself from moving closer, she recognized something in his expression that looked less like entitlement and more like grief. Christina left the boys under the supervision of a teenage lifeguard she'd befriended, then walked up the beach toward Dominic with her heart doing complicated things in her chest. He stood when she got close, and she noticed details she'd missed in their previous brief encounters. The weight he'd lost, the gray threading through his hair at the temples, the kind of exhaustion that came from fundamental life restructuring rather than simple lack of sleep. "You said you wanted distance," she said without preamble. "This doesn't look like distance." "I'm 50 yards away. I haven't spoken to them. I haven't." He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "You're right. I'm sorry. I was in town checking on the security team's rotation schedule, and I saw you walking toward the beach, and I needed to see them, even from a distance, even knowing I don't have the right." Christina looked back at Leo and Luca, who were now attempting to build a sandcastle in wet sand that refused to cooperate, their identical frustration visible even from this distance. "They ask about you," she heard herself admit. "Not by name, because they don't know your name, but they ask why some kids have fathers and they don't. Why their situation is different." Dominic's expression did something complicated, cycling through hope and pain in rapid succession. "What do you tell them?" "The truth, that their father made some very bad choices when they were born, but that he's trying to become someone better. That sometimes people need time to grow into the roles they're supposed to fill." She paused, watching a wave crash and retreat, leaving foam patterns on the packed sand. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, keeping them separate from you. I don't know if protection looks like distance or if I'm just punishing you for something you've already punished yourself for." "You're protecting them," Dominic said immediately. "That's never wrong, even if it means I only ever see them like this, from driftwood 50 yards away, watching them grow up in increments I have to steal. That's what I deserve, Christina. That's the consequence of telling you to get rid of it when it was the most precious thing I'd ever had a hand in creating." The ocean continued its rhythmic assault on the shore, indifferent to their conversation, and Christina thought about the last 6 months, about the nights when she'd lain awake wondering if keeping Leo and Luca from their father was protection or cruelty, about the moments when they'd done something that reminded her so viscerally of Dominic that it hurt. She thought about the man who'd thrown money at her like she was a problem to be solved, and she tried to reconcile that person with the one standing beside her now, who dismantled an empire for 2 children he'd only seen twice. "They're starting preschool next month," she said, the words coming out before she'd fully decided to speak them. "There's a parent orientation. You could, if you wanted, you could come to that. Not as their father, not yet, but as someone who's interested in their education, someone who's trying." Dominic's breath caught audibly, and when she looked at him, his eyes were bright with what might have been tears or might have been the reflection of afternoon sun on water. "Are you sure?" "No," Christina admitted. "I'm not sure about anything except that they deserve better than growing up thinking their father didn't want them. And you deserve the chance to prove that the person you've become is different from the person you were. But Dominic," she waited until he met her eyes fully, "if you hurt them, if you disappoint them, if you decide this is too hard or too complicated or not worth the effort, I will make sure you never see them again. Do you understand?" "I understand," he said, and his voice carried the weight of someone making a vow rather than just agreeing to terms. "I won't hurt them. I won't." He stopped, looked back at the boys who were now chasing waves with the kind of fearless joy unique to children who didn't yet understand danger. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be someone they can be proud of, even if they never know I'm their father. Even if the best I can hope for is watching from driftwood and attending orientations as some stranger who cares about their education." Down the beach, Leo shouted something about a crab, and both boys abandoned their sandcastle to investigate with Luca trailing behind his brother like he always did, like they were two parts of the same person, separated by minutes and personality, but fundamentally inseparable. Christina watched them and felt the familiar surge of fierce, protective love that had defined every decision she'd made since the night she'd walked out of Dominic's penthouse. "The orientation is September 15th at 6 p.m., she said, already turning back toward her sons, toward the life that was hers regardless of whether Dominic became part of it. "Don't be late, and don't expect forgiveness just because you show up. Forgiveness is something you earn over years, not moments." "I know," Dominic said to her, retreating back. "Thank you, Christina, for the chance, for keeping them safe, for becoming the kind of mother who loves them enough to protect them even from me." She didn't respond, just kept walking until she reached Leo and Luca, scooping them both into a hug that made them squirm and laugh and demand to know why she was being weird. Behind her, she knew Dominic was still standing on that piece of driftwood, still watching, still maintaining the exact distance she'd required while hopping for the day when distance became proximity. The tide was coming in, erasing their footprints and their abandoned sandcastle, making the beach new again with each wave's retreat. Christina held her sons and understood that this was what transformation actually looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but the slow accumulation of small decisions, of showing up even when it would be easier to disappear, of choosing love over pride repeatedly, until it became reflex rather than effort. Whether Dominic Ramirez could sustain that kind of transformation remained to be seen. But for the first time since she'd locked eyes with him across a crowded ballroom, Christina allowed herself to hope that maybe, eventually, her sons would have a father who'd learned that respect and love weren't things you demanded or purchased, but things you earned through the daily practice of choosing someone else's well-being over your own comfort. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and Leo and Luca were already asking if they could come back tomorrow. Christina said yes, because she always said yes to the beach, and because tomorrow was another day to build the kind of life where her sons knew they were wanted, where they grew up understanding that everyone, regardless of the work they did or the circumstances of their birth, deserved respect and love and the chance to be seen as fully human. Even Mafia bosses, who'd once been too broken to recognize a gift when it was kneeling in front of them, with soapy water dripping from cleaning gloves. Even mothers who'd fled in rainstorms and given birth in blizzards and built entire lives from nothing but determination and love. Everyone deserved respect. Everyone deserved the chance to transform. And some transformations, Christina thought as she watched the sun disappear into the Pacific, took a lifetime to complete, but were worth every painful step of the journey.